My husband disappeared and my daughter fell seriously ill. I'm writing this in a state that's hard to put into words. Everything that was familiar to me has crumbled like sand through my fingers. Just a few days ago, I would wake up in my warm bed, embracing Max, and everything seemed so normal and right. Now, I sit alone in our empty house, trying to make sense of what happened. Max was always my support, my rock, the person I could share everything with. His disappearance was a real shock to me. At first, I thought he had simply gone on business, maybe forgot to tell me, or something unexpected happened. But as the days went by with no word from him, I realized something was wrong. The sense of anxiety turned into fear, and then into utter despair. I started looking for him everywhere, calling friends, acquaintances, colleagues. No one knew where he was. His phone was turned off. I tried to reach his office, but it was closed. I called the police, but they couldn't help because not enough time had passed to declare him missing. I was left alone in a house that used to be our fortress, but now felt empty and cold. The situation worsened when I learned that Max's business had gone bankrupt. All our savings, everything we had accumulated over the years, vanished with him. How did this happen? How could he not tell me? All these questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers. I felt betrayed, though I understood he might not have known what to do either. I tried to collect my thoughts, but each day brought new blows. Our creditors began calling, demanding money I didn't have. I started to realize that all the stability I had relied on for so long was an illusion. Now, I was left alone with little Sophia in my arms, not knowing what to do next. It was hard to figure out how to move forward when your entire world is falling apart. I felt lost, as if I were in a nightmare with no way out. Every hour felt like an eternity, and each new day brought only pain and disappointment. My soul was shattered, and I didn't know how to piece it back together. My mother, Olga, tried to help, but even her support couldn't fill the emptiness inside me. She said I had to be strong for Sophia's sake, but I didn't know where to find that strength. All my thoughts were on Max. Where is he now? Is he alive? Will he ever come back to us? With each passing day, I became more withdrawn, losing faith that things would ever be okay again. I could no longer trust myself or this world. Life keeps breaking me over and over, and I don't know how much more I can endure. My inner struggle became unbearable. I constantly blamed myself for not noticing the problems earlier, for not supporting Max when he needed it. But I didn't even know if it was my fault or if fate was playing a cruel game with me. Sometimes I think it's punishment for living so well while others struggle to survive. Now, all I have left is little Sophia. Her smile is the only thing keeping me afloat in this sea of despair. I know I must fight for her, but even that seems like an impossible task. All these years I thought our life was perfect, but now I realize it was just a facade that crumbled at the first blow. I can't endure this pain any longer. Life keeps breaking me, and I fear that one day I'll just snap completely. But even when hope is gone, I must continue living for Sophia. She is not to blame for this chaos, and I have to find a way to protect her, even if I no longer know how to live myself. Now, I stand in front of the mirror and see a woman who no longer recognizes herself. Her eyes are empty, devoid of the light they once had. But I know I must keep fighting. Life may break me, but I can't let it break Sophia. I must find the strength, no matter how hard it is. This story is not over yet. It's only beginning, and I don't know how it will end. But I know one thing, I won't give up, even if it means going through even more pain. Now that I am alone with Sophia, I have to face things I never imagined. Our home, which once felt so warm and cozy, now seems like a prison with no escape. Every room reminds me of happy moments with Max, and it's becoming unbearable. Problems began even before Max disappeared, but I didn't give them much thought. He had become more withdrawn, often disappearing at work until late at night, and his phone conversations had become short and distant. I thought it was just temporary difficulties, that things would sort themselves out. But now I understand that he was trying to hide something from me. When I learned that the business had gone bankrupt, it was a punch to the gut. All our savings vanished with him, and I was left with debts I hadn't even suspected. I started checking our finances and discovered that all the accounts were empty. Credit cards were blocked, and I didn't even have money to buy groceries. Sophia doesn't understand what's happening, but her innocent questions only amplify my pain. I consulted a lawyer trying to understand what happened with Max's business, but it turned out the situation was much more complicated than I thought. It was revealed that Max had been keeping a double set of books, hiding the true state of affairs from me and other partners. It was a real scam, and I don't even know if he got himself into it or was forced into it. To understand what was happening, I began my own investigation. I spoke with Max's former colleagues, trying to find any clues, but everything only got more confusing. With each day, I felt like I was being pulled into an abyss with no way out. I started to doubt everything, even my own memory. What if I missed something? What if Max was completely different from what I thought? These questions gnawed at me from within, and I couldn't find answers. It feels like I'm starting to lose my mind. Every time I think about Max, I feel a growing anxiety and fear inside me. Every day, I deal with creditors who are putting increasing pressure on me. They demand repayment of the debts Max left behind, but I have neither money nor the means to find it. I feel this burden growing heavier, and I don't know how to manage it. Friends who once supported us are now turning away. They don't want to deal with what has happened. I feel utterly alone in a world where everyone seems only to think of themselves. My mother tries to support me, but even she can't grasp the full scale of the catastrophe I'm in. The worst part is that I don't know what happened to Max. I still hope he is alive and just trying to find a way out of this situation. But every time I try to imagine him, my heart tightens with pain. What if he is no longer among the living? What if he left me alone with these problems forever? I don't know how to go on. My faith in everything is shattered, and I can't see a way out of this situation. It feels like this nightmare will never end, and I don't know how to find the strength to keep fighting. But I know I must be strong for Sophia. She shouldn't suffer because of what happened to us. But how can I protect her when I can't even find answers to my own questions? This struggle with myself is becoming unbearable. Each new day brings only more questions, and I fear that one day I simply won't be able to endure. But even when it seems there is no hope left, I know I must continue living for Sophia. She is the only thing I have left in this world, and I can't allow her to suffer because of me. When my world fell apart and I was left alone, I had no choice but to pull myself together and start looking for answers. Max had always been the person I could rely on, and now his disappearance left me in complete uncertainty. My first thought was to reach out to Igor, his best friend, since he was the closest person to Max, and as I always believed, might know more than he let on. But the more I learned, the more doubts I had. Igor wasn't answering calls or responding to messages. At first, I thought he might have disappeared too, but my instinct told me something was off. All our savings were tied up in Max's business, and now that everything had vanished with him, it was crucial to understand what had happened. After speaking with some of his colleagues, I learned that Max's business had been facing serious problems in recent months. But what was even more shocking was that Max was involved in several shady deals that I hadn't even suspected. I went to Max's office, trying to find any documents or traces that could explain his disappearance. I came across his computer, where I found correspondence with Igor that had been deleted but was partially recoverable. It turned out that in the past few months, Max and Igor had been negotiating with some suspicious people, discussing large sums of money and risky investments. And this was just the beginning of my horrifying discoveries. With each new piece of information I found, my anxiety only grew. I was overwhelmed by a sense of betrayal as I realized that Igor had run off with all the money, leaving me with debts and a missing husband. It was hard to believe that someone I always considered a family friend could do such a thing. But what scared me even more was the possibility that Max might have been involved. My trust in people crumbled like a house of cards. Those I once relied on now seemed like traitors. The questions swirling in my head, what really happened? Where is Max? Became my daily nightmare. I decided to hire a private detective since I no longer knew whom to trust. The detective I hired took the case with thoroughness. He started tracking Igor's whereabouts, reviewing Max's financial reports and contacts. During this investigation, I felt like I was trapped, where each step forward only brought more darkness and despair. Nights were sleepless as I constantly pondered every possible scenario, from the worst to the utterly implausible. Despair and hopelessness became my constant companions. It felt as though life had turned into a nightmarish dream with no way to wake up. I understood that something significant remained beyond my sight, and it filled me with fear as I didn't know what awaited me ahead. The detective discovered that Max had been seen at a nightclub on the outskirts of the city, where he was meeting with unknown individuals. This club was known for being frequented by criminal elements, which only heightened my fear. I couldn't understand how my husband could end up in such a situation when he had always been a person with high moral principles. Gradually, I began to realize that maybe I never really knew the true Max. Perhaps our entire life together was built on lies. But the worst part was that I was left alone with these thoughts, and no one could help me untangle this mess. The more I tried to find the truth, the more I lost faith in people and in myself. Ultimately, I decided to act on my own. I realized that no one but me could find the answers to my questions. My love for Max had turned into a sharp sense of betrayal, but also into a powerful force that drove me forward. I knew that if I didn't find him, at least I would uncover the truth and understand what had happened. And even if that truth was harsh, it would free me from this dreadful state of uncertainty. Thus, I decided to delve even deeper into the investigation, searching for answers where I had previously feared to look. My struggle had only just begun, and I didn't know where it would lead me. But one thing I knew for sure: I would not stop until I found what I was searching for. After I decided to take the investigation into my own hands, every new day brought more questions than answers. I felt like I was being pulled into some sinister world that had been around all these years, but of which I had been completely unaware. The deeper I dug into Max's past, the more terrifying the reality became. I met with several people who had worked with Max. They all said the same thing. Max had changed recently, becoming involved in shady dealings and abandoning his old principles. One of his former partners even hinted that Max was involved in something very dangerous, but refused to elaborate on what exactly. I began to doubt whether I would ever understand what had really happened. But the worst was yet to come. One evening, as I was returning home, a man in a hood approached me. He knew everything about me: where I lived, where I worked, even details of my life with Max that only those closest to us knew. He said that if I continued digging, I could be in danger. His words sounded like a direct threat, but at the same time, they emphasized that I was on the right track. After that encounter, fear engulfed me even more. I realized that what I was trying to uncover could be far more serious than I had thought. I began to be haunted by nightmares, where I saw Max being pulled into a dark abyss with no escape. Waking up in a cold sweat, I knew I couldn't stop, but at the same time, I was afraid that this investigation would lead to even greater losses. I reached out to an old friend of mine, a lawyer named Dmitry, who agreed to help me sort through everything. Dmitry was an experienced attorney, and he started investigating Max's affairs on a legal level. With his help, I learned that Max had signed contracts with companies linked to organized crime. These contracts had many hidden traps, and it became clear that Max had been ensnared in a web of deceit and betrayal. One of the contracts involved a large sum of money that Max was supposed to receive for a deal, but instead of getting the money, he was left with nothing, and Igor disappeared with it. Dmitry suspected that this deal might have been the cause of all the problems. I was horrified by the realization that my husband was involved in such a dangerous world. Every time I learned new facts, a new twist of problems arose. I constantly felt like I was drowning in this chaos. I understood that I was on the brink, and if I went any further, I might get lost in this world with no hope of rescue. But at the same time, I was filled with the sense that I had to find the truth at any cost, even if it meant losing everything I had left. Despair, which had overtaken me, became my new companion. I could no longer trust people because I didn't know who might be involved in this conspiracy. With every step forward, I felt the ground beneath me growing more unstable. But I knew I couldn't stop, as there were only two options left. Either I would find Max and save our lives, or this investigation would destroy me completely. This struggle became my purpose, my only path to salvation. I could no longer see myself as the naive woman I used to be. I had become someone willing to risk everything for the truth. And even if this investigation led me to even greater despair, I could no longer retreat. My heart beat in rhythm with this relentless search, and I felt that the truth would soon be revealed, even if it turned out to be horrifying. This period of my life turned into a real nightmare. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, fate dealt another blow. Financial problems were escalating. Each day brought more debts and bills piling up one after another. All our savings had vanished along with Max, leaving me without any support. The situation with the legal issues was becoming more complex. More and more documents required signatures, consultations with lawyers, and all of this required money that I didn't have. My daughter Sophia suddenly fell ill. Her condition was rapidly deteriorating, and I couldn't find answers about what was wrong with her. The doctors offered various guesses, but none of them provided a definitive answer. I was in a panic, as I had no means to provide Sophia with the necessary treatment. All my efforts were focused on saving her, but at the same time, I felt like I was losing control over my own life. My mother, Olga, tried to support me. She was my pillar during these tough times. She was always there, helping with Sophia, taking on household chores so I could focus on fighting for our survival. But even her love and support couldn't save us from the trials we faced. Despite all these hardships, I felt that I couldn't give up. My internal struggle was relentless. Every day was a challenge. I fought for my survival, for my daughter's future, to find some way out of this trap. But with every new blow, I felt my strength fading. I was exhausted both physically and emotionally. Life seemed hopeless, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. I tried to pull myself together, but fear and helplessness increasingly overtook me. Sophia's condition worsened every day. The doctors suspected it could be something serious, but there was no specific diagnosis. Her fever kept rising, and no medication seemed to help. Watching my child suffer without knowing how to help her was unbearable. This despair was consuming me from within, and I was almost losing hope. Financial problems were worsening. Hospital debts were increasing, and I didn't know how to pay them. Debt collectors constantly called, threatening lawsuits and even greater financial sanctions. Each call sent me into a panic. I hid from the calls, fearing further demands. I felt like I would never escape this hell. One day, I stumbled upon Max's documents. They were old papers he had left in his office before disappearing. They contained a lot of information about his business, deals, and even some names. One of these names seemed familiar, and I began investigating whether it had any connection to the situation we were in. This new lead gave me hope, albeit faint, but it was a chance to find answers to many questions. My mother tried to help, but she too was exhausted. In her eyes, I saw the same despair that I felt. She did everything she could, but even her support couldn't resolve our problems. We both found ourselves trapped with no way out. But I understood that I had to fight until the end, even if I didn't know what awaited me ahead. In the darkest moments of my life, when it seemed there was no way out, I learned a terrifying truth. Max was alive and had deliberately left us. He had fled from his problems, leaving Sophia and me to fend for ourselves. This revelation was like a stab in the back. I couldn't believe that the person I loved could abandon us so callously. This betrayal hurt more than all the other trials I had faced. I stood before the mirror, looking at my reflection, which had become unrecognizable. All these days and weeks of struggling to survive had left their mark. I didn't have the strength to even cry. The heavy burden of responsibility for my daughter, financial difficulties, and news about Max kept me on edge. I couldn't understand how he could do this to us, but I had to put my emotions aside to focus on the problems that required immediate attention. Soon, Sophia's condition worsened. I took her to the hospital, and this time the doctors discovered a serious problem. She had a severe infection that had gone undiagnosed due to our inability to seek specialist care in time. Her condition required immediate hospitalization and expensive treatment that I simply couldn't afford. Looking at my little daughter, who was weakening day by day, I felt a terrible sense of helplessness and guilt for not being able to save her sooner. This became a turning point. I realized that I could no longer sit back and wait for life to sort itself out. I had to make a choice. Either I would find a way to overcome all these problems, or we would all perish. I started looking for any opportunities to earn money, taking on any job that came my way. I worked day and night to raise money for Sophia's treatment, neglecting my own health. Meanwhile, I continued the investigation into Max. The documents I had found earlier revealed many new details, and I realized that he was more deeply involved in criminal dealings than I had imagined. His debts and obligations to dubious individuals were so substantial that they jeopardized our lives. It turned out that Max was hiding not only from creditors, but also from criminals pursuing him, which created a serious threat to Sophia and me. All these events further complicated my situation. I had to fight on multiple fronts, secure treatment for Sophia, protect us from threats, and try to find a way out of this nightmare. Every day became a new challenge, and it felt like the world around me was collapsing. Eventually, I managed to get help from my mother, Olga, who started working to ease our financial situation a bit. Although her support was important, it still wasn't enough to fix the situation. We were exhausted both mentally and physically, but we continued to hold on. The sense of impending catastrophe that had haunted me for all these days was becoming unbearable. Just when it seemed like the worst was behind us, Max showed up on our apartment doorstep one day. He looked worn out, aged, and completely different from the man I had known before. At that moment, I felt two opposing emotions warring within me: joy that he was alive, and horrible anger that he had abandoned us at the worst possible time. But this was just the beginning of the conflicts. Max explained that he had been hiding from people he owed money to all this time. He claimed he had no choice but to disappear, and that he did it to protect Sophia and me. His words sounded like excuses, and I could barely hold back tears of outrage. Could you forgive someone who ran away from problems, leaving their family to fend for themselves? We decided to try to get out of this mess together. Max started working wherever he could to at least partially repay the debts. I also continued my hard work, but the relationship between us was no longer the same as before. It was hard to rebuild trust when it had been shattered to the core. Although we tried to act as a team, feelings of despair and frustration left their mark. Sophia began to improve, and this gave me some hope. However, every day was a trial as the debts continued to weigh us down. Max and I often argued over trivial matters, and it seemed like our efforts only made things worse. At one point, I realized I wasn't sure if I was ready to continue this life, constantly feeling like a victim of circumstances. Yet something had changed within me. After everything we had been through, I felt stronger and more capable than ever before. I realized that I could keep fighting, even if it meant starting a new life without Max. Our chances of recovery seemed minimal, but I understood that I didn't want to give up. We began to make a plan to pay off the remaining debts and restore stability in Sophia's life. I decided to return to school and acquire a new profession that would offer better career opportunities. Max also chose to change his field to avoid repeating past mistakes. We both knew that our relationship might not withstand this pressure, but we understood that we had to keep moving forward, even if our paths diverged. The past few weeks had been tough, but I felt that something had changed inside me. The constant fear was gradually replaced by determination. I realized I was ready to start a new life, even if it meant leaving the old one behind. And although our future with Max remained uncertain, I was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. Sophia began to smile more often, and this was the greatest reward for me. She is still young, but I want her to grow up in an environment of stability and love, not in the shadow of constant fears and debts. This is now my main goal. I am no longer the helpless woman I was at the beginning of this story. I have learned to fight and survive under the most challenging conditions. And now, as life throws new challenges my way, I am ready for them. Within a few months, our lives began to stabilize a bit, although it required incredible effort. Max and I were still trying to work together, but it felt like this partnership existed more out of necessity than out of love. It seemed that we were both holding on only for Sophia and our commitment to our daughter. However, each time we faced new difficulties, I became stronger. I realized that a new life awaited me, and I was ready to fight for it, even if it meant leaving the past behind. Max might have been trying to change, but our trust was so shattered that its restoration seemed impossible. Eventually, we came to the realization that each of us needed to move forward on our own path. It was a hard decision, but I knew it would be better for everyone. I felt that I had finally freed myself from the burden of past fears and disappointments. Now I look at the future with hope, understanding that my path will be difficult, but it will be mine, and I am ready to follow it to the end. Now, when I look at Sophia, I see not only my daughter, but also a reminder of how important it is not to give up. I am ready to fight for her, for myself, and for our new life. And no matter what happens next, I know we will manage. This story does not end with everything becoming perfect, but with me finding the strength to start with a clean slate. And now I am ready for whatever life brings. It seemed that the worst was behind us when one day Max appeared on the doorstep of our apartment. He looked worn out, aged, and entirely different from the man I had known before. At that moment, I felt two opposing emotions warring within me: joy that he was alive, and terrible anger that he had left us at the worst possible time. But this was just the beginning of the conflicts. Max explained that he had been hiding from people he owed money to all this time. He insisted he had no choice but to disappear, and that he did it to protect Sophia and me. His words sounded like excuses, and I could barely hold back tears of outrage. Could you forgive someone who ran away from problems, leaving their family to fend for themselves? We decided to try to get out of this mess together. Max started working wherever he could to at least partially repay the debts. I also continued my hard work, but the relationship between us was no longer the same as before. It was hard to rebuild trust when it had been shattered to the core. Although we tried to act as a team, feelings of despair and frustration left their mark. Sophia began to improve, and this gave me some hope. However, every day was a challenge as the debts continued to weigh us down. Max and I often argued over trivial matters, and it seemed like our efforts only made the situation worse. At one point, I realized that I wasn't sure if I was ready to continue living a life where I constantly felt like a victim of circumstances. But something changed within me. After everything we had been through, I felt stronger and more capable than ever before. I realized that I could keep fighting, even if it meant starting a new life without Max. Our chances of recovery seemed minimal, but I understood that I didn't want to give up. We started to build a plan to pay off the remaining debts and restore stability in Sophia's life. I decided to return to school and get a new profession that would offer more career opportunities. Max also decided to change his career direction to avoid repeating past mistakes. We both knew that our relationship might not withstand this pressure, but we also understood that we had to keep moving forward, even if our paths diverged. The past few weeks had been tough, but I felt that something had shifted inside me. The feeling of constant fear gradually gave way to determination. I realized that I was ready to start a new life, even if it meant leaving the old one behind. And although our future together with Max remained uncertain, I was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. Sophia started to smile more often, and this became the greatest reward for me. She is still young, but I want her to grow up in an environment of stability and love, not in the shadow of constant fears and debts. This is now my main goal. I am no longer the helpless woman I was at the beginning of this story. I have learned to fight and survive under the toughest conditions. And now, as life throws new challenges my way, I am ready for them. Within a few months, our lives began to stabilize a bit, although it required incredible effort. Max and I were still trying to work together, but it felt like this partnership existed more out of necessity than out of love. It seemed that we were both holding on only for Sophia and our commitment to our daughter. However, each time we faced new difficulties, I became stronger. I realized that a new life awaited me, and I was ready to fight for it, even if it meant leaving the past behind. Max might have been trying to change, but our trust was so shattered that its restoration seemed impossible. Eventually, we came to the realization that each of us needed to move forward on our own path. It was a hard decision, but I knew it would be better for everyone. I felt that I had finally freed myself from the burden of past fears and disappointments. Now I look at the future with hope, understanding that my path will be difficult, but it will be mine, and I am ready to follow it to the end. Now, when I look at Sophia, I see not only my daughter, but also a reminder of how important it is not to give up. I am ready to fight for her, for myself, and for our new life. And no matter what happens next, I know we will manage. This story doesn't end with everything becoming perfect, but with me finding the strength to start fresh. And now I'm ready for whatever life brings. Thank you for reading my story. Great things start from small beginnings, and each of us can contribute to the fight for justice. Feel free to share your thoughts on this story from my life in the comments below.